what. If there are any other questions, we will take them. Otherwise, because we are running out of time, we will request the next speaker, Professor Siddharth Satpathy, to join us and take this forward, because we are already 20 minutes behind time. So if there are questions, we will take them at a later point of time. So just give me 1 minute to introduce Siddharth, because although I am sure that everybody knows him and he apparently doesn't need any introduction, I wouldn't be doing it justice if I don't briefly introduce him. Professor Siddharth Satpathy teaches in the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. He has taught courses on South Asian intellectual tradition for the American Institute of Indian Studies, New Delhi. He is presently working on a book-length study of the narratives produced by English Baptist missions in Odisha in the 19th century. And he's also engaged, as you know, with this particular literary endeavor. And I will not stand between you and him. We all look forward to this very interesting concluding talk, which kind of sums up and prepares an umbrella within which all this discourse has been taking place for the last 3 days. So over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. What I would do is to, without much further ado, go to the presentation that I have, about 8 to 9 slides to show. Let me just figure out how I can bring it to you. Is it visible? Can somebody give me a quick response through the audio? I cannot see the chat box at the moment. So I assume it's visible to you. Hello? Hello?
We can see it. Oh, it went away.
Yeah, you can see it, Priti? Okay. So the title of my presentation is The Polite World of the Bhagavata, Homo Religiosus in Colonial Cuttack. What I would do, or what I mean by that, is to present a reception history of this seminal text in the long 19th century. So for my starting point, I have taken Ramadasa's Dadhyata Bhakti Rasamrita, the 2 volumes, 1768, the other one 1800. Much has already been talked about Dadhyata Bhakti Rasamrita, so I'm not going to go into the details. What I'm saying there is that Jagannatha Dasa's hagiography, as it's being represented in the text, talks about or recalls how popular the text was within Dasa's own time, and how that particular hagiography describes that popularity. I have made some points there. That Dasa's text, Dasa deliberately appealed to women, and women listened to his Gita and Artha and kind of got enchanted by him. This is what the Khala people complained of Dasa. And then Dasa responds to these people, to this allegation, that he goes to all the castes, to those who are beyond the pale of caste, to old and young, to men and women, whoever has Shraddha, he goes to him or her. And eventually the king invites Dasa to recite the Bhagavata in the royal court. My point is, here is a moment in late 18th century when the popularity of the text is being recalled and in the process reiterated. The concluding point for my paper would be the essay by Jagabandhu Singha, Bhagavata Ghara. It comes out in a volume which was published in 1929. What this prose essay does is that it offers a description of the Bhagavata Ghara as a rural institution. It recalls how it was a Shiksha Mandira where education happens, Bichara Mandira where deliberation happens, Sadharana Sabhagruha. It was a Panthanivas, people stayed over. It was, it also hosted or had a kind of a common fund, a Bhagavata Gosain ka Panthi or a Kotha Jama, from which people could borrow stuff, take money and contribute and all that. And the point here is that Jagabandhu Singha says that Bhagavata Ghara as an institution has the best of it is in the past. So as an institution, it's on the decline. So these are the two kinds of responses to the Bhagavata and Bhagavata Ghara, which serve as the starting point and the concluding point of my observations. And within these two dates, the beginning and the concluding one, I would like to point out three kinds of reception moment. But before we go to the reception moment, I would take a couple of minutes to talk about what exactly did they receive, or what kind of, or what a reception of what that I am interested in, or that one could think about. I know I'm borrowing the term Homo Religiosus from a different context, and I'm just trying to explore whether there can be a correspondence or what kind of differences would be there that I would like to explore at a later stage. But at the moment, the term or the concept helps me to arrive at the figure of the Sujana in Bhagavata. Now, and it's the reception of this Sujana, the Sajjan, that's what we are going to talk about. Now, Sujana, the listener and the reader, is the model human in the Bhagavata. And there are several examples of it or instances of it when the Sujana is being invoked. And this is one example from the first skandha. Then what does this Sujana pursue? The pursuits of Sujana. He pursues Sukha, and he also pursues Nistara, Tariba, Moksha, stuff like that. So both Sukha and Moksha. And these are the some couplets where you find these concepts at work. Now, related terms to Sujana, there are several terms which would help us, or if we pay attention to them, which would help us to clarify for our understanding what exactly does the Bhagavata mean, or Jagannatha Dasa mean by the term Sujana. The one word that I would like to focus more on is this word Jantu. Jantu, Jibba, Prani, these are all related words. And this word finds repeated mention in the text throughout various skandhas. And the idea is that the Jantu needs or turns itself into a Sujana through a process of cultivation, through the process of cultivating Bhakti. So here is an instance of that transition from the Dasamaskandha, and that I would like to read out a little bit. This is the transition from Jantu to Sujana. Sakala Jantu madhye tuhi biharu atmar atma rupa hoi guru bachanu jnana sara paije karanti bichara Bhakti bhavare jnana labha, huoi jara padma nabha, bhava jaladhi se taranti, maya patale na padanti. So when I have written it out in Roman literatures, Roman letters, it becomes difficult for me to read it out. But the point here is that, in my interpretation, or it seems the larger sense would be that when you begin to cultivate yourself through a certain process, then from Jantu to Sujana, that transition happens. So there is a space for pedagogy. Now, the conduct of Sujana, and that's the last pointer that I would like to make about this category, Sujana at the point, at this moment. What does this guy do? Or what does this character do? The conduct involves several things. One, abhyasa. And abhyasa of what? Abhyasa of many things, including knowledge, including bhakti, including disciplines, stuff like that. And the other way to describe the conduct is samadrushti. Samadrushti, viewing all in a manner that can approach or can think about samata, samadrushti. Nirapeksha is another word which you find being used. This is from the 11th skandha. And beyond samadrushti, you find something like utsava. Mohara utsava samasta, kariba sakhya anumata, mohara utsava parva parve, bhave pujiva nanamate, emante puji bahu bidhe, banchiva utsava anande. So utsava as a way of life. So the conduct of the Sujana would include the hosting or carrying out utsava as a mode of life, as a way of life, as ananda. And avinaya. Avinaya is something that is also described, nritya, abhinaya, and as a part of the Sujana's life. So let me take a pause here, and I'm trying to spell out what exactly here with this character Sujana is happening, or why I talk about it. If we want to talk about the reception of the Bhagavata text in a certain way, then what exactly are we thinking of trying to trace? So what I'm trying to trace here is the career of this particular model of conduct, model of human life that Bhagavata sets up as Sujana. And as I said, or as we have been thinking about, these works are in progress, so their natures will take a final shape later on, will obviously go through certain evolutions and all that, certain corrections, certain reorientations and all that. But at the moment, let me spell out the three moments. This is the first reception moment, the reception moment from Baptist historiography. Now, if we take a point or take a moment to read this particular long description that we find in the history of the mission that Amos Sutton wrote in 1850, what we find is that it's an unusual scene in the sense, or unusual passage in the sense that generally you would find passages which are denigrating, which are more hostile in their tone and intent, but also on certain occasions that you find this kind of a polite portrait or a polite description. And what Sutton does is he would say, or he would connect this kind of a polite scene with a certain textual tradition in Odia. And that textual tradition he would call as a reform, as a local and vernacular tradition of reform, and at the heart of which, of that textual tradition, is the Bhagavatam, particularly Jagannatha Dasa's Bhagavatam. So this scene, the way or the reason why I would like to connect it to a polite people in the sense that it refers to a certain class of people who are neither poor nor from the aristocracy, who are well off. For instance, the crimson and silk dresses that it mentions, I tried finding out that what would be the price of a silk dress in 1850. The closest that I could come to is to find that in 1873, the price of a Maniyabandhi Joda, the silk costume for a man, a fashionable man, would be about 10 rupees. And then I also found that the average wage of a Christian native preacher who was hired in the early 1830s would be about 5 to 7 rupees a month. So that gives us some sense that those who could afford a silk dress in 1850s would belong to a certain section of the people. So in this way, if we analyze this particular scene that he constructs, and we do not have the time to take you through all the analysis that could be done, for instance, about land ownership, there is a description here that people make their way through scattered villages and thread their way through the rice fields, jungle. So remember the land, the colonial intervention in the land is happening in 1839 onwards, if not earlier, and certainly from earlier, but the more embedded ones are happening now, more thought out ones are happening now. So, and also what kind of music do they listen to, what kind of theatrical exhibitions they might have come across. So some of this archival work would help me to argue that this kind of a scene belongs to a polite people. And then we go to the local and vernacular reform, the text that he assigns to this particular scene, in the sense, in his method, he connects an empirical portrait with a text. And the text is Bhagavatam, and you find as early as 1832, Amos Sutton saying that the Bhagavata is the textbook of most of the Odiyas. And he's quoting from the 11th skandha. Sakala mantra madhya sara tribidha brahmamu onkara. And goes on to say there are some of the tracts which he was involved in the production of. So they would quote from the Bhagavata to say what kind of texts it is and what kind of reformist element it has. But the point is that this local and vernacular tradition of reform that Sutton points out, it predates colonialism, and it's an incomplete reform that would supposedly find fulfillment in Christianity. That's the trajectory of Christian historiography. So basically, a polite people, a polite text. That combination is happening in Baptist reception. Then we move on to the 7th slide that I would like to show, the second moment of reception. And this is a moment of reception which is happening in early Odia public sphere, where, and I have 2 slides here. One is to show how the Bhagavata comes onto the public sphere. And here it comes through in the shape of tracts, as I mentioned in my abstract. So Rasakrida comes out, Rasa Panchadhyayi, in 1873. Gajanistarana comes out in 1874, and Dhruvastuti in 1876. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the aesthetics which is involved in this polite scene of stuti is an aesthetics of sociability. So on the one hand, you have the exemplar bhakta. On the other hand, you have the narrative frame, the guys who are talking about it. And finally, you have the deliverer who comes to the rescue in some sense. And between them, there is not an equal sociability, but rather than there is an agreeable sociability. So they are in dialogue with each other. That's the point that I'm trying to make. And the reader and the listener were invited to engage with the scene, and in the process, they would cultivate their own practice of bhakti. So when I came to conceptualize this scene of stuti, then I wanted to find out what kind of other texts were available or comparable other kinds of texts which were available in the Odia public sphere at this point in time, which could serve to throw a relief to this polite sin of stuti, or in relation to which stuti would acquire its politeness. And I found that at this point, you would find the Brahma sermon coming into Cuttack. So this is a particular paragraph that I have quoted from this Utkala Brahma Mandirara Sayamkalina Upadesha from 1884. In 31st August 1884, and it comes from the Brahma periodical Sevaka. And the title is Hey Brahma Samaj, Brahma Vani Sravana Kara. And it goes on. So if you read it, my point that I'm trying to make is that it's a didactic aesthetics. And if you go back to the formulations, at least that I am familiar with, on the polite scene in early modern Britain, the early 18th century, early 18th century Britain, the contrast is precisely between a sermon and a polite scene of the gentleman. So what you find here, if the sermon is coming via the Brahmos to Cuttack, and that didactic aesthetics comes, it can stand as a contrast to the scene of the stuti. The scene of the stuti as the polite scene, and this as a didactic scene. So that's the contrast that I'm trying to work on there, and to see if it works to trace a polite history of the reception. And then, so in fact, this stuti is what would characterize Sujana. And the Sujana who visits the Utsava would also, as we saw, Utsava is a way of life for the Sujana. And then we come to the last slide, the third and final moment of reception that I would like to talk about or think about. It's the modern literary response to the Bhagavata. And what I find is the two particular examples from engagement with the Bhagavata comes to a fore in the 1910s, 1920s, if not earlier. Literary response to it, a literary engagement with it. So what you find is the Bhagavata becomes a kind of a platform or a way to talk about, again, in a sense, sociability. So what you find here is that Fakir Mohan Senapati wrote a short story, Bagula Baguli, and at the heart of it is Bhagavata. What do I mean? The story tells us is about the life of Chokidar and his son. The father Chokidar is in regular habit of going to the Bhagavat Ghara, listening to Bhagavata, has a command not only over the content of Bhagavata, that is, he would recite poems or the padas from the Bhagavata from memory, but he also has a command over the form, the social form which the Bhagavata generates, that is dialogue. So keeping the Bhagavata as a kind of a point of departure, what Senapati is trying to say is that this father Chokidar can form dialogues with all the members of the village community. And that ability to form dialogues, theological dialogues with the people around him, helps him to have an access to a kind of a rural sociability. And the son, even if the son has a command over the Bhagavata, in terms of a comparable command over the Bhagavata, he can memorize the poems, recite and all that, he doesn't have a command over that social form, the dialogue. So that's the contrast he's setting up there. And if you come to Gopinath Nanda Sarma, who wrote the first sustained Odia literary criticism on Bhagavata, Shrimad Bhagavata Samalochana, 1919 and 20, what you find here is that Gopinath Nanda Sarma tries to set up an appropriate and agreeable reader, a reader who's not kutida, a reader who will be able to engage with the Bhagavata in the spirit that it demands. And the preface that Gopabandhu Das wrote to the criticism would say that this agreeable reader is the quintessential Odia reader, in a sense, or in my interpretation. So what you find in Nanda is that agreeable reader, and in Senapati, that sociable chokidar, both kind of pointing help me to think about how the text becomes a ground on which a kind of a sociability is constructed. So let me summarize what I have tried to do. I have tried to do a reception history of this prominent text, the Bhagavata by Jagannatha Dasa. I have taken as my point of departure Dadhyata Bhakti, when a certain kind of recalling of popularity and its reiteration is happening. And I have taken as a point in 1920s, when the assumption is that the Bhagavata as an institution, the Bhagavata Ghara as an institution, is past its prime. And in between, what we have done is to track three moments of reception history, and what is being received is the Sujana, the model of human conduct. So we briefly talked about what the Sujana is in the Bhagavata, its certain features of it. And then we quickly moved on to the first moment of reception, which is the Baptist one. Then we went on where the polite people come to the fore, a particular class. Then we come to a second moment in early Odia public sphere, where the genre comes to the fore, the stuti, the scene of the stuti, and the sermon coming into a conflict with each other. Sort of polite genre is at work. The third moment is when you find the modern Odia literary response to it, a literary hermeneutics as well, where the Bhagavata becomes an opportunity, or provides an opportunity to construct certain kinds of sociabilities, certain kinds of agreeabilities. So that's where I would conclude, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Siddharth, for a wonderful discourse. There are so many questions which are coming your way, but probably I would like to take the lead by asking a few myself before giving an opportunity to the others. So, what I would just like to share with you is that don't you think that the current interaction, I would say, renewed interest in the Odia Bhagavata is the fourth one that you would probably need to address as well, which has been there for the last 20 years or so. That's one of the things. The second point is that when you're talking about this polite world, I believe that there is also a very strong resemblance with the Bengali concept of Bhadralok, which I don't know, you must have been aware of it. It may not be explicit, but it is very implicit here, because when we are talking about Brahmo, that influence is also something which, and especially for the people of Cuttack, that is something which probably is significant. So the concept of Vadalop probably re-understood in a different way. And the third point is that, don't you think that we are still in a state where you see that all the four traditions of reception that you are talking about still coexist? Because in many villages, we find that even now Bhagavad Tungis do exist. In certain temple premises, still Bhagavad is recited in particular ways. And we have Bhakti channels where we have a didactic presentation from the high throne. There are a lot of Odia devotional channels where there are experts, within quotes, who talk about it. So isn't that, in spite of waning interests in certain traditions, I would say waning of certain traditions, don't these traditions actually coexist? Nonetheless. So just some observations. And then I'm sure I can read out the questions, but also you can take the questions.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik. So let me begin with the last point first, the decline. In a sense, I was reminded of that essay by that book, Country and the City, where Raymond Williams would go in search of the country and would find that it's perpetually in decline. I mean, as far back as he could trace, people would lament that, look, the country is gone, or the countryside is gone. So, in a sense, the way I look at Jagabandhu Singha is to see it as a moment in the reception history, not necessarily as history, not necessarily as accurate in terms of its truth claim or anything, which it may be, which it may not be, I do not know. But he gives an opportunity to think about kind of a moment where one can see a lament coming in. And that lament that Jagabandhu Singha has, and those of us who have read him would see that he laments everything. I mean, the whole past is gone, the glory is gone. So that kind of a lament is present there. So what you said is actually right. The last years of, in the recent televised, the recent interest in the Bhagavata, that's very much present. But I'm not, to be completely honest, I'm not aware of it, actually, of the recent interest as such. I know vaguely that there would be people, the Bhagavata has come onto the television medium and probably other platforms as well. But in a lighter vein, I would say the historian in me would always prefer something in the past to think about. The more contemporary it is, the more, how do I say, it gives me less of a kick to comment on in the more contemporary. But I would definitely see that how the late 20th century moment can be connected to the earlier moments. Second, the Bangla and Vadalop connections. It does. It probably have a connection in terms of the Cuttack, the formation of Cuttack as a sphere where Bhadrata or Vadalop becomes kind of a cultural hero in late 19th century. The irony would be that the Vadalok in late 19th century colonial Cuttack would be the Brahmo, in the sense that Madhusudan Rao, probably the writer of the passage that we read out, most probably it's Madhusudan, if not somebody else from the Brahmo side. And my point is, the Brahmo genre of sermon, if we understand the term polite genre, where nobody preaches to somebody else, rather it's a kind of an exchange or a dialogue between two people, more or less equal, then I do understand that the stuti doesn't have that kind of an equality embedded in it, but it has a certain form of a dialogue which is different from the genre of the didactic aesthetics of a Brahmo Bhadralok. So my whole point would be here is to do a kind of a counter history to the Brahmo and to see that the older form has a certain kind of politeness which the Brahmo sermon doesn't. So that's where I would like to pause my thoughts there, unless I explore more about it.
Thank you very much, Siddharth. Just one quick point, which we can take up later, because there are a series of questions coming in, which is about these points you made: Abhyas, Samadrushti, Utsava, and Avina. So when it comes to Utsav, this is something I would like to say. Utsav generally is a high point. Utsav is generally a high point. It's a culmination. So don't you think there is an element of paradox to say that my entire life is an Utsav? Just to interrogate this point.
Yeah.
And the other one is, how does Avina figure here? Is it as a subset of Utsav?
Yeah. That's a nice point. That here Utsav is actually a climax. So Utsav would be a high point. So how can we conceptualize a mundane life and everyday life in terms of Utsav in perpetual, as a kind of a perpetual Utsav? I would need to think more about it. But what at the moment I can think of in terms of a response would be that the bhakti idea would be that if you're constantly in touch with the high, that's the whole point of the bhakti life. So that continuous in touch with the high uh, would actually go with the idea of utsav.
So
So
it might be that continuous practice of certain precepts
so
would
continuous
transform life
practice
into an utsava.
into a
That's a
certain kind
possible
of you remain in touch with
step. Yes, yes.
something on the high. So yeah.
Thank you, Siddharth. There are a number of other questions. Would you like me to read them out for you, or would you like to just go through them and quickly respond?
I would I think um, uh,
I will just read out a couple. I
yeah,
think it
that's
was
better.
Professor Ashok Mahapatra says that it was the same Amos Sutton who, in the introduction to his English Odia lexicon, uh, who talked about one of the purposes of dictionary making was to alert the natives that the English ladies can understand the obscenities of the palanquin bearers now which they mouthed while they were carrying them. So this is an interesting take on the impolite social space that surrounded the hallowed space of Bhakti.
Yeah,
So
I mean, uh, I would say, see, the same agents who would probably be carrying the palanquins would, when they enter into the bhakti social space, um, see, I mean, interestingly, both the impolite and the polite social spaces would be adjacent to each other. Without being adjacent to each other, the polite space wouldn't carry the value as such. So I do agree. I do agree, and and the obscenities with the palanquin bearers. I mean, one that reminds me. I don't think we have time, but I'll quickly say one description that Sutton provides. If I remember right, it's Sutton. Uh, the palanquin bearers. Once a missionary was coming from Puri to Cuttack, and on the way they have a little child, and the child is sick, few days old, and the child passes away. So the missionaries do not talk about it. The husband and wife, they cannot talk about it because they fear that the custom of the Odia palanquin bearers is that they won't carry a corpse. So if they come to know that the baby has died for some dysentery or some sickness, then they may not carry it. So the so they wouldn't intrude into that space of the palanquin bearers as such, the whether polite or impolite. So that's just a kind of a thought. It's just an idea that came to talk about another instance where palanquins bearers are talked about in the mission archive.
thank you. I think there are two quick questions you might like to respond to, maybe very quickly. One is Professor Preeti Misra. I was struck by your discussion of the transformation of Jantu to Sujana through Bhakti. It seems very analogous to a process of civilization, the making of civility.
That is true. I think that is something what I'm trying to think about. And this whole idea of a civility and cultivating civility as a kind of a habit, your everyday habit in your own life, and that setting that up as a model as well of cultivation, that is at work. So this process of civilizing pedagogy is what is precisely the Sujana is about. And I think that's at work in the Bhagavata, and that's what these later accounts also try to draw upon.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Pratik.
much. One last question before we close this session. This is from Professor Uppal Chakravarti. He says that what do you think would be the different agendas involved in Satan and Senapati's interest in agrarian sociability through the Bhagavad?
Good question. Uppal, I would say that the kind of agrarian sociability that Sutton is trying to evoke in 1850s is a kind of a sociability which would eventually have or be attached to a kind of a Christianization telos. So yes, it's sociable, yes, it's polite, but then to be properly polite, it needs to be something else as well. So that transition telos is present in that agrarian social that is trying to think about or write about. Though, I mean, let me move on to make to connect it to Fakir Mohan. In Fakir Mohan's case, the rural sociability that he's trying to set up is something of a loss, something which is gone. So in Fakir Mohan's case, just as in case of the 1920s, Jagabandhu Singha and others, they're mourning a rural sociability which is gone. There, so the so the aesthetics of these two rural sociabilities would differ in terms of the orientations that they have. In one case, it's a future-oriented kind of a thing. As far as the temporality is concerned, in the other case, it's about the past, which is gone. So it's past-oriented in that sense, a lamentation-oriented in that sense. So, and the other ways in which one can think about these different rural sociabilities, the way in which I was thinking about is, or beginning to grasp the differences was, I was characterizing the rural sociability or the social scene that Sutton is talking about is the ancient regime. It's not modern yet. And the kind of sociability that Fakir Mohan talks about is enabled only with a consciousness that modernity has arrived and it has replaced the sociabilities of the past. So that's what I would like to think of in terms of a quick response. But I would think about it. Thanks for asking.
Thank you very much. One concluding question, which would probably need a one-word answer, is from Professor Ujjwal Jana, which is that, do we have any equivalent term for polite in Odia in the sense that you are using it?
The polite term is the Sujana.
Thank you very much.
So you won't find a concrete correspondence. A concrete correspondence is not what we are looking forward here.
Thank you very much. So it has been a wonderful session, and we are way behind schedule, but I am sure that nobody minds the fact that we are running behind schedule because it has been a very, very fruitful session so far. So over to Professor Preeti Mishra to take things forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Panak. And I agree, I've learned a lot again today. So thank you, Siddharth, for putting all of this together. I think the next order of business is that Siddharth will give us a vote of thanks, and then we'll take a 5-minute break and meet again on Zoom for the roundtable, which will be chaired by Professor Mahapatra. And I will leave the Zoom link in the comments here as well in case people can't find it. Over to you, Siddharth.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Preeti. And the time is short, so what I will do is to do a quick vote of thanks. It's been an amazing 3 days that we have gathered to talk about this idea of Bhakti in Bhakti intellectual traditions in Odisha. Let me begin by thanking Shilpa and Sikha and others who have been associated with conducting this event here. They have done a tireless job, so we should thank them first. And then I would like to thank scholars who have chaired the sessions, Professor Vijay Danta, Professor Sunita Mishra, Professor Priyadarshi Patnaik, and Professor Ashok Mahapatra, who would chair the roundtable. I do understand, apart from presenting your own 15-20 minutes presentations, you have been involved and engaged with the conversation. And that's one of the reasons why I think the quality of the conversation has been quite lively. So I do convey my thanks to them. Then I would like to convey a big thank you to the paper presenters. I know many of us were not acquainted or familiar with the Bhakti traditions as such, and didn't have a interest or intellectual interest in it as such. But they have kindly agreed to be a part of this project and be a part of this conference. That speaks volumes about their intellectual generosity and as well as their friendship. So we appreciate that, and we are deeply thankful for that. I would like to take a moment to thank Professor Jagannatha Dasa, who provided his paper. Despite his ill health, he took an interest to write out the paper and to send it to us, and gave us an opportunity to read it out. So thanks to him as well. So beyond the paper presenters, I would like to go on to thank some of the institutions who have been helpful. The Odisha State Museum and its officials, a big thank you to them. They have been wonderful in providing the texts, many of the manuscripts, so that we can carry the conversation forward. And also the Bhaktivedanta Research Center, Dr. Sumant Rudraji and Balaram Leeladasji provided us with manuscripts, and access to works, access to manuscripts is quite crucial in any project that deals with pre-colonial period where the print is not yet available. And even the early printed texts that they provided, we are grateful to them as well. And there are several people who would like to thank, and the time is short, and I would like to convey our regards to them who have been associated with us in the project. And we will continue to look forward to remain in touch. And last but not the least, I would like to thank Dr. Khagendra Patra, who provided his initial notes on a paper, an abstract, which he couldn't present on account of familial health conditions. This abstract is about the Sanskrit texts of Odisha, which a Sanskrit biography of Chaitanya, and Sanskrit play as well from a little earlier period. And these are wonderful points or abstracts that he has made, and we would look forward to create an opportunity at a future junction, at a future point when we could actually listen to him on this platform, the Intellectual Histories of Bhakti projects platform. And beyond that, I would like to thank Krishna Gopalanandaji of Radha Shyam Sundar Temple in Vrindavan, who provided manuscripts, and the Jiva Institute of Vaishnava Studies, who have also helped in our explorations in Vrindavan region as such. So thank you so much, and it was great to have all of you here, and looking forward to our roundtable shortly. Thank you.